Imagine that happening too in your town or in Auckland City here. This is what's happened, that main hub, pretty empty.
Yeah, well, and also there's a cost associated to this as well, isn't there, that we cannot ignore. And if you were a Wellingtonian, that would be a question you may want to know the answer to. 20-odd years ago, the Civic Square was very vibrant and full because the library was there and there was all this other activities in and around it. But, you know, it's actually fallen by the wayside. I know there are plans from the council that are due to be presented to the council pretty shortly. Yeah. But 2 years doing nothing and sitting around is really a lack of government, local government, really, isn't it? They haven't moved far enough or fast enough on this, nearly.
Wellingtonians, be interested to hear your thoughts on that. Do you use Civic Square? What do you make of it? And how do you think it should be repurposed? Paul from Wanaka here, he says among the throngs would like to see water exporting nationalised. The government sets up a plan on the west coast of the South Island and the profits used to reduce the gap between rich and poor in Aotearoa. There you go. Finally, now dopamine fasting, a fad that's gaining popularity in the tech industry in Silicon Valley, where people switch off completely in a bid to emerge with a cleaner, fresher mind. An article published in the BBC talks about a man who works in Silicon Valley who, when it's time for what they call a dopamine fast, cuts himself off from as much external stimuli as possible. He doesn't eat. He doesn't look at his phone. And he even tries to avoid making eye contact with people. But a psychologist, Dr. Cameron Sepa, who published a guide on how to do a dopamine fast, says that approach is extreme. Nonetheless, there is something to having a bit of a time out from all these external stressful activities. Raven Can, is a dopamine fast something that you might get into?
It's an interesting way to put it. I feel like I have an addiction to touching my phone. And I never thought of that as but I guess it is. It's always a hit of dopamine. You're thinking, ooh, what might have happened on my phone? And so you have a quick look at, whatever. But I'm not sure that this works because let's say you do this weird thing for a day where you blindfold yourself and don't talk to anyone.
That's right.
Sure, the first time you then touch your phone again, that's a maze, but then that would also wear off, I guess, within 5 minutes, wouldn't it? So aren't you just sort of building up for this 5 minute hit?
Isn't the irony is not lost, is it? The irony is not lost. The very people who made these machines to give you the dopamine hits are now talking about dopamine fasting in a very earnest way. It's a load of bollocks, frankly. It's a load of old tosh. Just put your phone down.
No, but doing everything, avoiding eye contact, Janet, not looking at your phone, not eating.
Lummy, save me.
Just
save me.
Having a 20-minute nap in the middle of the day.
We should be bottling dopamine and selling it overseas in an ethical way.
Godfather.
New Zealand-based dopamine. But there is something to it, isn't there? I mean, that's part of the reason why you perhaps moved to the regions, isn't it?
Well, yes, reflection is a fabulous thing, but, turning your phone off and calling it dopamine fasting is just rubbish.
Or did you just move to live near an aquifer?
That's right, I did.
Clean, fresh brown water. Wonderful stuff. Raven Can, Janet Wilson, thank you very much for being with us.
Cheers, guys.
Thursday's panel. I'm Wallace Chapman. See you tomorrow. And Mike Rehu is taking over for next week while I'm on leave. Good stuff.
Te whakarongo mai koe ki te reo irirangi o Aotearoa. This is Checkpoint on RNZ National. I'm Lisa Owen. E haere aki nei, a cold killer who eroticised the death of Grace Millane or a young man who freaked out in an unexpected crisis. The stark choices presented in the trial of the man accused of killing the British backpacker. The jury is hours from beginning its deliberations. Were patient rights breached when PHARMAC forced them to change epilepsy drugs? The Health and Disability Commissioner is investigating. I beg your pardon, not now, Rose Garden. Some residents reject plans for an Erebus memorial because it could ruin a park's happy vibe. The welfare wars, is the government doing enough in the battle against poverty? And Prince Andrew walks away from royal duties, so should he leave his title behind too?
RNZ News at 5. Kia ora ko Susana Leata with DNA. New Zealand First Leader Winston Peters says he has no knowledge of his lawyer threatening a $30 million lawsuit against a National MP. Dr Nick Smith tabled an email he received from Brian Henry in Parliament this afternoon. The letter included a threat to sue for defamation and damages if he or National Party leader Simon Bridges repeat their comments outside the House that there has been an electoral loan scam. Asked today what he knew about the threats, Mr Peters responded he had no idea what the media were talking about.
Well, why don't you ask him? I mean, you're asking me about an action, the details of which I'm not privy to, and I think you should ask the person who is bringing the action, not to come to someone who's not a source at all.
Winston Peters says the New Zealand First Foundation has written to the Electoral Commission making itself available to meet to discuss any details about its investigation. The defence is closing in the trial of the man accused of murdering Grace Millane, telling the jury the British backpacker's death was an accident. The 27-year-old is accused of strangling the British backpacker to death last December. This afternoon, his lawyer, Ian Brookie, said Ms Millane died because rough sex between two drunk, inexperienced people went wrong.
Yes, when confronted with the crisis of this unexpected, unforeseen and unintended death, the defendant freaked out. He reacted badly. He acted selfishly.
Ian Brookie said there was ample evidence to corroborate the accused's account that Ms Millane encouraged choking during sex. This morning, the prosecutor, Brian Dickey, told the jury the accused couldn't possibly be innocent if he strangled the young woman for the 5 to 10 minutes required to kill someone by strangulation. The Regional Economic Development Minister Shane Jones says he didn't know a company applying for provincial growth funding had New Zealand First ties when the information came across his desk. Future Forest Products applied for a $15 million loan to carry out a feasibility study in April, which was declined this month. The company's founding director, Brian Henry, is a New Zealand First judicial officer and a lawyer for Winston Peters. But despite the project being referenced in information given to the minister in July and September, Shane Jones says he was none the wiser.
The entity, Forest International or whatever it is, I have no knowledge of that entity. I wouldn't even recognise it being associated with Brian Henry.
Shane Jones says once he knew, he took immediate action to declare a conflict of interest. A flatmate of the Dunedin doctor on trial for murder has described seeing the accused sexually assault a young woman as she was unconscious. 32-year-old Bernard Scanther denies murdering 16-year-old Amber Rose Rush in February last year. A flatmate of Mr Scanther's in 2017, Thomas Russell, told the High Court at Dunedin he witnessed Mr Scanther sexually assault a teenage visitor to their flat.
I remember Vinnie was touching her vagina as she was unconscious and explaining to the rest of the room that, look at her moaning, she liked it.
Thomas Russell. Google will no longer allow political campaigns to target advertising at people based on their supposed political leanings. Campaigns will also be unable to match their own database of prospective voters against Google's user base to target individuals on other platforms such as YouTube. Campaigns will still be able to target based on age, gender and location. Google says it will also take action on obviously misleading statements in ads. Erebus family members are saddened that the construction of a national memorial to the air accident has been delayed because of community opposition. A memorial to acknowledge the 257 people who died in the tragedy was planned for Auckland's Dovemeyer Robinson Park in Parnell, but a sod-turning ceremony scheduled for next Thursday, the 40th anniversary of the crash, has been postponed due to opposition to the memorial from neighbours. John Stewart, whose aunt died in the crash, says the protesters need to think hard about what it is they are opposing.
I think they are losing sight of the enormous impact it had on the nation at the time, and I think they just need to, quote, get a life, unquote, and put up with whatever imagined encroachments on their views and lives are.
74-year-old John Stewart worries that with continued delays, he won't be around to see an Erebus memorial completed. It's 5:05. England are 144 for 3 on a slow-moving first day of the first cricket test against New Zealand at Bay Oval in Mount Maunganui. It's the first time Mount Maunganui has hosted a test match, and England have found the pitch slow, making it difficult to score runs. Medium pacer Colin de Grandhomme has been the most successful of the New Zealand bowlers, taking 2 wickets, while Neil Wagner has taken the other. Meanwhile, in the first test in Brisbane, Pakistan are 77 for 3 against Australia. The newly appointed Wallabies coach Dave Rennie isn't planning on bringing a swag of fellow New Zealanders with him when he takes charge of the Australian rugby side next year. The former Chiefs coach has turned down a chance to claim the All Blacks berth by accepting an offer from Rugby Australia. The move comes despite calls for the Wallabies to have an Australian coach, but Rennie says it's important he has a strong Australian flavour to his coaching staff. Meanwhile, Tonga have been withdrawn from the Oceania Rugby Women's Champs in Fiji following a measles outbreak in the team. The team has been quarantined for 18 days. A New Zealand development side is playing at the tournament with their next match against Australia A tomorrow. The Auckland Tuatara will try to put a tumultuous week behind them when their Australian National Baseball League campaign starts against Perth Heat in Auckland tonight. The side's 23-year-old American third base Ryan Costello died in his sleep on Monday, having only recently arrived from the Minnesota Twins. That's the news.
Prince Andrew steps back from public duties over his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein.
It is a recognition that his position was becoming entirely untenable and unsustainable.
Quid pro quo, quid pro no.
I followed the directions of the president because the president directed us to do so.
I want no quid pro quo. Tell President Zelensky to do the right thing. So here's my answer. I want nothing.
Major international stories as they happen. Morning Report weekdays from 6 on air and online.
Then on 9 to noon, how can New Zealand make the most of the global boom in film and television production? And after 10, BBC journalist Carrie Gracie's successful fight for pay equality. Join me, Catherine Ryan, on 9 to noon after Morning Report on RNZ National.
Now the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. For all of the North Island, fine weather, however isolated showers for Gisborne and the ranges of Hawke's Bay and Eastern Bay of Plenty, clearing tonight. Nelson and Marlborough, fine and warm weather tomorrow. Bulla, fine spells, isolated showers tonight. Westland, mostly cloudy, isolated showers becoming widespread tomorrow night. Canterbury, Otago and Southland, mostly fine, but scattered rain for Otago and Southland tonight. Warm tomorrow, with nor'westerly gales in exposed parts of Canterbury High Country, Southern Lakes, Central Otago, Southland and Clutha. Scattered showers will return to Southland, Clutha and Dunedin tomorrow night. Fiordland and Stewart Island, a few showers turning to rain tomorrow with nor'westerly gales in exposed places. Chatham Islands, fine weather. RNZ National, it's 8 minutes past 5.
Thanks, Susanna. This is Checkpoint and I'm Lisa Owen. Is the man accused of murdering British backpacker Grace Millane a calm and calculated killer, or a young man who panicked after a sex act went wrong? That's what the jury in the trial of the 27-year-old accused have today been asked to decide after hearing the closing addresses from lawyers for both the Crown and the defence. It's the Crown's case the man intentionally strangled the British backpacker in his apartment last December. He denies this, and his defence team says she died during consensual rough sex. Our reporter Sarah Robson has been covering the case and filed this report. And just a reminder, it does contain details that some people may find distressing.
Crown Prosecutor Brian Dickey explained to the jury there are 2 pathways to murder: murderous intent or reckless disregard for someone's life.
In this case, we've killed Grace Millane, the defendant. Gentleman over here at the back, behind me, had to have had her under his grip, suffocating her, if that's the right term. Strangling her is probably the correct term, for a total of what would be approximately 5 to 10 minutes.
Mr. Dickey said at some point Ms. Millane would have lost consciousness.
And would have become under his hand hold unconscious and limp and lifeless, and he had to carry on. And if that's not reckless murder in this country, ladies and gentlemen, somebody will have to explain to me what is.
Mr Dickey said it couldn't possibly be a case of rough sex gone wrong.
This is not sex play. This is not restricted breath games.
Mr Dickey took aim at the defence's argument there was no motive for the accused to murder the British backpacker. He held up 7 explicit photos the Crown says the accused took of Ms Millane after she died.
He took that photograph there when she was dead.
Sitting in the front row of the public gallery, Ms Millane's parents, David and Gillian, became increasingly upset as Mr Dickey continued.
He has eroticised the death of British backpacker Grace Millane, which occurred under his handhold and on her birthday.
Mr Dickey said those photos were the accused's ultimate triumph over Ms Millane, his trophy photos. He also questioned the accused's failure to call 111.
If you thought you'd hurt somebody really badly and by accident, your response in that circumstance, in close quarters, you're in the same room, you've got a phone, you've got phones available to you. You know this is a young woman a long way from home. Your response must be to dial the emergency services.
Instead, Mr Dickey said the accused used his phone to search Waitakere Ranges and Hottest Fire.
So he's got a work plan to deal with the situation. Cool, calm, and in control. Where's the evidence of panic?
And Mr Dickey said there was a reason the accused repeatedly lied to the police in his first interview about what happened on the night Ms Millane died.
Because he's trying to get away with it altogether. And why is that? That's because he knows what he's done, and what he's done is killed the British tourist, and that's murder in his own mind.
Mr Dickey urged the jury not to place too much weight on the defence's evidence about Ms Millane's interest in BDSM.
This case isn't about whether Grace Millane consented to having sex with the defendant and that being rough sex. That's not what this case is about. This case is about her being strangled to death. You can't consent to your own murder.
In his closing address, the accused man's lawyer, Ian Brookie, reaffirmed it was the defence's case that no murder took place. He said Ms Millane's death was an accident after rough sex between 2 drunk and inexperienced people went wrong.
Yes, when confronted with the crisis of this unexpected, unforeseen and unintended death, the defendant freaked out. He reacted badly. He acted selfishly.
But Mr Brookie said the accused's actions didn't reflect what was going through his mind when he put his hands on Ms Millane's neck.
You might think, from having looked at all of the evidence here, that in fact his actions are consistent with someone who did not cope when they were confronted with this crisis and took steps to try and avoid having to explain what looks so bad. The stakes were high here. This is not just knocking over a milk jug. This is somebody, as he said, dead on his floor.
Mr Brookie said the accused didn't have to speak to the police, but did twice, and ended up showing them where he buried Ms Millane. During the trial, the jury was told that the accused lied to a number of the women he met up with after connecting on Tinder. Mr Brookie said it wasn't sinister.
He's insecure, he's single, he's trying to find a relationship, he's trying to impress girls.
Meanwhile, Mr Brookie said the pathological evidence that it takes between 5 and 10 minutes to kill someone by strangulation wasn't as clear-cut as the Crown suggested. He said it could be less than that, and no one was sure at what point someone might lose consciousness. Mr Brookie also pointed to the lack of defensive injuries on Ms Millane's body. But Crown Prosecutor Brian Dickey had earlier told the jury she couldn't possibly have sustained injuries from defending herself if she was unconscious. Earlier today, Mr Dickey told the jury a verdict of manslaughter was technically available in all murder cases, but neither side had suggested there was evidence to support it. Justice Moore will sum up the case to the jury of 7 women and 5 men tomorrow. Mō te hōtaka o te ahi, ko Sarah Robson, aho.
A National MP has called for an inquiry into PHARMAC after 4 people died following an epilepsy drug brand switch. 2 complaints have now been laid with the Health and Disability Commissioner alleging the drug buying agency breached patient rights to be treated with respect, to make informed choices and to give consent. The Commissioner says he wants answers. Investigative reporter Guy Onespina has more.
Carmel takes lamotrigine and has been caught up in the PHARMAC brand switch. She says the information given to patients was minimal.
It's been abysmal. It is as if PHARMAC didn't know the Code of Patient Rights existed. And PHARMAC has trod all over that and has ignored it. And you don't treat people like that, particularly vulnerable health patients.
Hers is one of 2 complaints made to the Health and Disability Commissioner, Anthony Hill. He's issued a statement to RNZ.
This matter raises significant issues and I will be following this up with PHARMAC. It is important that patients have the information they need to make informed choices, including understanding the risks and benefits of treatment options.
PHARMAC was switching up to 11,000 people from the Lamictal and Arrow brands of lamotrigine to the generic version Logum in a bid to save $30 million. Many patients had no idea their medicine was being changed until they looked at their pills, felt unwell, began having seizures or heard about the change in the news media. MedSafe warned PHARMAC against the switch, saying it posed safety issues, but advised the drug buying agency that if it went ahead, all patients should see a GP before switching and vulnerable patients should see a specialist. PHARMAC rejected that specialist recommendation and decided patients should not be given a lot of information. Minutes from one PHARMAC subcommittee meeting read,
Members considered that there was a risk of causing unnecessary anxiety about the change if too much emphasis was placed on the change, and that caution should be taken with the amount of information provided to patients up front.
4 deaths and nearly 50 adverse reactions have been reported to the Centre for Adverse Reactions Monitoring over suspicions they are linked to the brand switch. Following reports of the deaths and under pressure from Epilepsy New Zealand, PHARMAC backed down on the brand switch last week, announcing it would make it easier in most circumstances for people to obtain funding to stay on their preferred medicine. But the U-turn has not stopped the questions. National's health spokesman Michael Woodhouse, who was previously restrained in his criticism of PHARMAC's handling of the switch, is now calling for a full ministerial inquiry into the decision.
They have steadfastly defended the original decision and they should have nothing to fear from an inquiry. But the reversal and the number of adverse events that we have heard about since the 1st of October certainly makes me think that the public are owed an explanation about the original decision and the change in that decision.
Michael Woodhouse says he questions whether aggressive brand switches, where brand drugs are often replaced with generics, have been forced on PHARMAC through lack of funding.
They are being sweated financially, and I think they're being forced into making cost-saving decisions that maybe with greater resourcing they would have been able to find other priorities for that investment.
Arabella Gube, who has a 4-year-old daughter with epilepsy, has been an advocate for patients forced to switch brands. She's gone further, calling for PHARMAC CEO Sarah Fitt and the agency's board to resign.
I think it's time for them to go. If this was a business, a company, ignoring the advice of a safety regulator and pushing forward with a risky decision, and 4 lives were potentially lost, and hundreds of lives were ruined, they would stand down.
Documents obtained under the Official Information Act show that prior to the brand switch, PHARMAC thought it could use the lamotrigine change to research the nocebo effect, when a patient suffers side effects brought on by a perception their medicine is inferior. And prior to the brand switch, PHARMAC had said it would consider using the change as an opportunity to get real-world experience on whether counselling patients on the nocebo effect leads to a greater acceptance of the brand change. Epilepsy New Zealand CEO Ross Smith says there may be yet more complaints to the Health and Disability Commissioner over the lack of information given to patients.
People feel that their rights under the Act have been breached, and one of those is about consent. We're absolutely not surprised that someone has gone to this length. There's a lot of very upset and angry people in the epilepsy community about how this has been handled.
PHARMAC's handling of the brand switch now under intense scrutiny. For Checkpoint, Guy and Espiner.
And PHARMAC has responded this afternoon with a statement from Director of Operations Lisa Williams. PHARMAC says it could have done more to inform and reassure patients, but it did communicate. Among other things, PHARMAC put in place a 5-month transition period to allow people time to change brands. It sent information leaflets to health professionals to distribute and held a Facebook Live event in June. PHARMAC also says any person using lamotrigine can apply for funding to stay on their current brand rather than a Logum. Now, more than 400 people have applied and PHARMAC has approved 113 of those applications. PHARMAC says Logum has been approved for use in New Zealand by MedSafe, the New Zealand Medicines and Medical Devices Safety Authority, and is used in a number of other countries. And for most of the people taking it, Logum works in the same way as the other two brands. Patients who have been prescribed Logum should not stop taking it and raise any concerns with your doctor, and PHARMAC will refund you for those visits. It is 21 minutes after 5 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. We'd love to hear from you if you are using this medication. Let us know how you were treated during the transition. Did you have enough information? Did you have choice? And, well, did you give consent? You can text us on 2101, you can tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ or send us an email, checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Winston Peters, personal lawyer and the trustee of the New Zealand First Foundation, has threatened a $30 million lawsuit against a National MP in the latest twist in the donation scandal. The Electoral Commission is considering a complaint about the use of the foundation for donations and whether New Zealand First has met disclosure obligations. Accusations have been flying, but today Nick Smith was told that if he repeated allegations he'd been making outside of the House, he'd find himself in court. Our political editor Jane Patterson has the latest.
The New Zealand First Foundation has loaned the party nearly $200,000 since the last election. Brian Henry is a trustee of the foundation. Former MP and party president Doug Wollerton is the other. National has been pursuing New Zealand First and the Prime Minister over allegations about the handling of those donations, including its senior MP Nick Smith in Parliament yesterday.
This is a rort with a capital R.
It was comments like that prompted the warning email, which Nick Smith tabled in Parliament this afternoon.
From the Right Honourable Winston Peters lawyer, Mr Brian Henry, threatening to sue for $30 million if statements made in Parliament are repeated outside the House with the exclusion of some personal information in that email.
Is there any objection to that being tabled? Appears to be none.
Speaking to reporters afterwards, Dr Smith said it was very concerning. An MP going about their duty of holding the government to account should receive such a threat.
I feel very strongly about the importance of New Zealand having a high level of transparency. I take great pride that when National left government, New Zealand had the top ranking in the world as the least corrupt country. It makes you very nervous of that work when effectively your financial well-being of your family is being threatened.
The email from Brian Henry, that was to Nick Smith and the party leader Simon Bridges, said media reports about the foundation had been false and malicious. He said there was one loan from the foundation of $73,000 to cover a post-election shortfall, which was repaid in full over 2 years. However, in a statement, the Electoral Commission told RNZ that according to New Zealand First's returns, there was one loan of $73,000 entered into in December 2017 and another separate loan of just over $76,000 disclosed in May 2018. The Commission said it understood that loan was to replace the first loan. Then there was a further loan of nearly $45,000 disclosed in April 2018. The party leader and Deputy Prime Minister Winston Peters, at a police graduation with the Prime Minister, told reporters he had no knowledge about the legal threat.
I've got no idea what you're talking about. Right?
Brian Henry's acting on his own.
Well, why don't you ask him? I mean, you're asking me about an action, the details of which I'm not privy to, and I think you should ask the person who's bringing the action, not to come to someone who's not a source at all.
And he says those involved have been in touch with the Electoral Commission.
I understand also from advice I've received overnight that the New Zealand First Foundation has itself voluntarily written to the Commission to make itself available for conversation and discussions and communications. That's all I know.
Meanwhile, the National Party leader Simon Bridges is ratcheting up the pressure on Jacinda Ardern, calling for her to enforce the Cabinet Manual. Ms Ardern has said it's not her role to investigate other political parties. That should be left to the likes of the Electoral Commission, the police or the Serious Fraud Office. But Mr Bridges says the Cabinet Manual is clear. Ministers are expected to act lawfully and to behave in a way that upholds and is seen to uphold the highest ethical standards, and that they are responsible to her as Prime Minister. Ms Ardern was asked if she would only act on legal rather than ethical breaches.
Ultimately, it's for these agencies to determine whether the law has been upheld, and I don't think it's unreasonable to allow them to do their job.
Prime Minister, that's not what I've asked you though. You're talking about law breaking there, the law. What about ethical standards?
And again, I want to allow the Electoral Commission to do their job. They will determine what the outcome should be in this case.
And the spotlight is now on one New Zealand First MP in particular, the Tauranga-based Clayton Mitchell. According to the news website Stuff, he's had bills paid for him by the foundation, including about $10,000 for travel and $12,000 for legal advice. He's also been described as having a key role in collecting donations for the party. RNZ has approached Mr Mitchell several times, including going to his electorate office in Tauranga, but so far he has not responded to requests for comment. From Parliament for Checkpoint, Jane Patterson.
Prince Andrew has walked away from royal duties for the foreseeable future, but should he also walk away from his royal title? In a statement, the Duke of York says the controversy surrounding his ill-judged association with the convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein has caused major disruption to the royal family's work. The Prince categorically denies allegations he had sex with a then 17-year-old Virginia Roberts, who was allegedly procured for him by Epstein, who killed himself in jail while awaiting trial on sex trafficking charges. But the scandal escalated after Andrew did an interview with the BBC. British journalist and commentator Louise Mensch says the Prince's departure from royal duties is not enough.
Big wow. I mean, nobody knows what he does anyway. He is not exactly the world's hardest working member of the royal family, and if he thinks that this is going to cut it in terms of a penance, he's very much mistaken.
So what would it take?
I think that he should ask the Queen, his mother, to issue letters patent, removing his title, removing the title of the Duke of York, and pretty much removing his Royal Highness title as well. I don't think somebody who has been friends with a paedophile for as long as he has and still hasn't apologised for what he did can seriously remain a member of the royal family. Prince Andrew is a Vice Admiral of the Royal Navy right now. And the other thing he's got to do is immediately resign from that position.
The thing is, though, people will say, some people, that he hasn't been charged with anything. He's not guilty of anything at this point in the eyes of the law. Why should he be punished for the actions of someone else who was found guilty?
Because, as you rightly say, Epstein was found guilty in the eyes of the law, and Andrew doesn't have to have committed a crime himself directly for this to be true. However, I think what's coming down the pipe is going to be even worse, if you can imagine it, than what is out there now, The reason people want him to talk to the FBI is the rumours are very strong over here in America, in the United States, that they have discovered more evidence on Prince Andrew. But even if there was nothing else there, if there was no other contact with women, this is a man who has insulted and called a liar Virginia Roberts, who's in that famous photograph with him. He's insulted Epstein's victims. He hasn't apologised. He just cannot continue as a member of the royal family and as even ceremonial as an admiral in the Royal Navy. He is bringing shame and disgrace on Britain and indeed everywhere where he is a prince.
Who do you think's behind today's move, this statement, this stepping aside of royal duties? Do you think he's done it of his own free will?
Definitely not. I think the Queen's press people probably went to her and said, "We're really sorry, Your Majesty, but this is just not going to do it." And also, of course, you've had a flood of people that sponsor various charities where he is a patron saying we will not sponsor them anymore while Prince Andrew is involved. So he's basically jumping before he's pushed. He's stepping back from these so-called royal duties because if he doesn't, all these charities are going to kick him out. And he doesn't want the shame and embarrassment. It's not real remorse. It's that he doesn't want the shame and embarrassment of people saying you're not our patron anymore. And that's why he's done it.
So you don't believe that his contrition is genuine? He writes, "I continue to unequivocally regret my ill-judged association with Jeffrey Epstein." Goes on to say, "I can only hope in time," referring to the victims, "that they will be able to rebuild their lives." You don't think he is genuine in his concern?
That's not an apology. That's not an apology. That I regret it, my ill-judged association. No, it was wrong. He was a convicted paedophile when you went to stay with him. It was flat wrong, and then what you did to the victims of re-victimising them and then talking about them as though you don't care about them and you're the world's most honourable man has only made it worse. It's added insult to injury. So, no, I mean, he hasn't even said sorry, and even if he did say sorry, none of us would believe him.
So what's your feeling? Do people care about this? People who don't care about the royal family, do they care about Prince Andrew and the allegations swirling around him?
I think absolutely everybody cares about paedophilia, whether or not you are the world's most ardent Republican and like Prince who, it doesn't matter. The fact is, this is a guy who sucks up to a convicted paedophile who stayed at his house for 4 days and then called one of his victims, with whom the guy was photographed, a liar. That person can't be in a position of responsibility, even a ceremonial position of responsibility in a Western democracy, whether you are into the royal family or not. I don't know, I have to say up himself. He's very concerned about his title and his honorifics and calling himself Royal Highness and so forth. That title needs to go. The Queen has absolute rights over titles. She can issue something called letters patent and she can take it away. And as difficult as it will be for her to do that to her own son, whom she obviously loves, the Queen has always put her country first and her duty first. And I think she's going to have to in this case as well.
British journalist and commentator Louise Mensch. Coming up on Checkpoint on RNZ National, the Auckland residents pushing back against an Erebus memorial, why it's too sad for their backyard. Social Development Minister Carmel Sepuloni fronts up to criticism over the government's families package, and the lucky llamas lining up a date with royalty when legend and Pete meet Charles in Kaikoura. We'd love your feedback on anything you've heard on the program this evening. You can text us 2101, you can tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, or you can send us through an email. And the address for that is checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. It is time for the headlines now.
Lawyers in the trial of the man accused of murdering Grace Millane in December last year have made their closing addresses to the jury. The Crown's case is that the man intentionally strangled the British backpacker in his apartment. The 27-year-old accused denies this, and his defence team say she died during consensual rough sex. The court has adjourned until tomorrow morning, when Justice Moore will sum up the case to the jury. The New Zealand First Leader Winston Peters says he doesn't know the details about his lawyer threatening a $30 million lawsuit against a National MP. Nick Smith says Brian Henry's letter threatened to sue for defamation if National MP's repeated comments about an electoral loan scam outside Parliament. Asked about the threat, Mr Peters said reporters should approach Mr Henry. A flatmate of Dunedin doctor Bernard Scanther has described seeing him sexually assault a young woman while she was unconscious. The 32-year-old is on trial for murdering 16-year-old Amber Rose Rush in February last year, which he denies. Thomas Russell, who flattered with the accused in 2017, told the High Court at Dunedin he saw the assault on the teenage visitor. Regional Economic Development Minister Shane Jones says he didn't know a company applying for provincial growth funding had New Zealand First ties when the information came across his desk. Future Forest Products applied for a $15 million loan for a feasibility study in April, which was declined this month. The company's founding director, Brian Henry, is a New Zealand First judicial officer and a lawyer for Winston Peters. Erebus family members are sad about the delay in constructing a national memorial to the 1979 plane crash due to community opposition. The memorial to the 257 people who died in the tragedy was planned for Auckland's Dovemeyer Robinson Park in Parnell. But a ceremony scheduled for next Thursday, the 40th anniversary of the crash, has been postponed because of opposition from neighbours. Those are the latest news headlines from RNZ National. Our next news and weather update is at 6.
Thanks, Susanna, and thanks for joining us. This is Checkpoint, and I'm Lisa Owen. Let's go now to business news with Nona Peltier. Nona, tell us about Ryman Healthcare. So this is the biggest retirement village operator. People might be familiar with the name. And they've had a solid increase in their first half-year profit. What's kind of driving it?
They called their result adequate, so that does say something. Nevertheless, they did make quite a reasonably good profit. Numbers were up, 11% to 188 million. And that included some revaluation gains that weren't realized. And also, when you look at their underlying profit, it was just up, 6% to 103 million. This is a pretty good result, but they called it adequate because I think they could have done better if they had their developments that they have in works had proceeded. So they've got I think about 12 different projects underway, and this is about half of them, there are a number of them in Melbourne, and the rest of them here in New Zealand, primarily Auckland. But they've had some delays. Some of the sites that they have are difficult to develop, so that they're not getting ahead with some of them. So, and also construction constraints in the Auckland market have also weighed down on the company. But they have their own construction team, and they're really expecting things to pick up in the rest of the year. So the market wasn't thrilled with the result, but look, it's still a pretty good company. And so their share price was down, 10 cents to $14.24. Still pretty good result, just the same.
So Amazon across the Tasman, and this is always an interesting debate. So there is talk brewing about how little they have paid in Australia in terms of tax.
I think it's 20 million Australian dollars against income revenue of $1 billion. Of course, they do pay the tax on profits, but they don't have to report their result in Australia as such. And because it is an overseas company, this is an interesting one because we have the same problem here in New Zealand. The companies, these big, large companies, which are making large profits, presumably, off their advertising revenue. And because a lot of, we can see it reflected in the media industry. So what the media industry isn't getting, the big companies like Facebook, Google, Amazon, etc., they're getting it. And so the OECD is leading a movement. We're hoping that there'll be some kind of decision by 2020. Which will address this across the globe so that one country won't be left as an outlier and being penalized in some way because of the way that, I guess if you tax me, then I'll tax you, that kind of idea. So they're working on it. It's going to be a multilateral, plan. We don't know what the details will be, but at some point, this is going to come to an end. I think that there will be ways of making these guys pay their fair share. So, that was a story out of Australia today. And so overall, our index, it fell 17 points to 10,958. And that there's a general downbeat mood in the market because there's concern now, you guessed it, China and the U.S. trade talks aren't really going that well. And some people are expecting that a Tier 1 deal might be deferred until next year. And so that's unsettled the market.
Spooking people.
Yeah, it's spooking people. Our dollar, though, it's holding steady at 64.1 US cents, 94.3 Australian, and 49.6 pence, which is about where it was yesterday.
Yeah, thanks, Nona. Appreciate that. That's Nona Peltier with our business wrap. A storm is brewing in an affluent Auckland suburb where residents are battling to stop the government building an Erebus memorial in a local park. It's been 40 years since Air New Zealand Flight 901 crashed into the side of the Antarctic mountain, killing all 257 on board. And some families of the dead are dismayed that there is still no memorial. Many are saddened that protests from the Parnell Park's neighbours have caused further delays, with some calling them NIMBYs who need to get a life. Susan Strongman reports.
From under the boughs of a majestic Pahutakawa tree, a grassy lawn gently slopes towards the Waitemata Harbour. This is the spot in Dovemeyer Robinson Park, better known as the Parnell Rose Gardens, for which an Erebus memorial is planned. But the project has been delayed due to objections from neighbours who say the large structure is not suitable. A campaign to save the park is spearheaded by residents Anne Coney and Joe Malcolm, who say the memorial would ruin the happy vibe of the green space.
I can understand why someone might want to put a memorial in a place that's as beautiful as this, but memorials are sad. And this is a really sad memorial. 257 people. And I think absolutely a memorial is not the wrong thing to do. Our only objection is the site. The site is not the most appropriate site for a national memorial.
Malcolm says her husband, whose father died in the crash, supports her views. The monument, called Te Paerangi Ata Ata Sky Song, features a large cantilevered concrete pathway rising northeast towards the harbour, flanked by high walls featuring 257 individual snowflakes and the names of the dead. Catherine Carter, whose father, pilot Jim Collins, died in the crash, was one of the family members involved in selecting the design.
The idea behind the concept of the design relates to the sky, or Journey into the Sky, which is quite specific to the Erebus accident, because all the people on board the aircraft were, including the cockpit crew and all the passengers, were really looking forward to the journey to the ice because it was something that was unique and special.
Ms. Carter and other Erebus family members were looking forward to a sod-turning ceremony next week on the 40th anniversary of the tragedy. But neighbours' protests delayed landowner approval and the sod-turning plans have been cancelled.
Delays are always disappointing in this regard. I think it's you hope for a resolution, you hope for something to happen that will be a gathering place for families affected by Erebus, and it's just the goalposts shifted again, and that's hard.
John Stewart was 34 when his aunt, Dawn Matthews, died in the crash. He's now 74 and says 40 years is an inexcusably long time to wait for a memorial.
I think if the memorial had been gone ahead with in its current form and position when things were still relatively fresh in the public mind, I don't think you'd have this NIMBYism that's happening in Parnell with the locals. NIMBYism, not in my backyard.
John Stewart worries he won't be around to see the Erebus memorial completed. But Parnell resident Anne Coney denies accusations of NIMBYism.
Well, I don't think it's about being a NIMBY. It's that it just doesn't, it's way too big for this small park. And if it's someplace else with more space around it, well, that's fine. But if they want a memorial here, please could it be in keeping with the small Edwardian area? And that's fine, most welcome. But for a thing that looks like an on-ramp to the Third Harbour Bridge crossing, please put it in a larger space.
Anne Coney and Joe Malcolm have lobbied against the memorial, setting up a Facebook page, a petition, engaging lawyers and even threatening to protest the now cancelled sod turning. Consequently, the Waitemata Local Board, which owns the land, has delayed its decision and has opened public consultation on the memorial. Parnell resident and historian Rendell McIntosh believes an initial lack of consultation is what's bugged locals, rather than a severe case of NIMBYism.
No, I honestly believe it's just that it's taken people by surprise, that there wasn't the good consultation in the early days. It could have easily been a letterbox drop, for example, put around the local people, just saying, give us your thoughts on either yes or no. So literally it was put through as a fait accompli, that it was just automatically decided. So I think that was the main anger from a lot of the local people, and then obviously as time goes on, then they get emotionally sort of caught up and say, is the scale wrong, and that type of thing. So there certainly has been a momentum against the sculpture going in.
Either way, retired Police Inspector Greg Gilpin, who helped recover bodies of the dead from the mountain, is disappointed at the neighbours' reaction.
This is New Zealand's largest disaster in terms of loss of life, and there's still nothing. No memorial to remember these people who died. It seems like it's a case of people not wanting it in their own backyard or whatever. It sounds rather selfish to me, but I know what they would say to me. If it was in your backyard, would you want it? And I would want it. I mean, because I think it would be an honour to have it, to remember these people who died. So it's difficult to understand, really.
But Anne Coney and Joe Malcolm are still convinced that the Parnell Park is not the right place, as it already has monuments commemorating the Korean War, Dutch soldiers, and a plethora of remembrance benches. Ms. Malcolm says she doesn't think the lives lost in Erebus are any more important than the memorials already in the park.
How is this enhancing the site? How does this add any value to the site? We would not see the sea. From here, we would simply have lost our view.
The Waitemata Local Board will decide whether to say yes or no to the Erebus National Memorial at a meeting on December 3rd. For Checkpoint, ko Susan Strongman aho.
And it's about 13 minutes to 6. I'm Lisa Owen and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Let us know what you think about that. Is the Parnell Rose Garden the appropriate place for a memorial to the Erebus crash victims? And if not, where should this go? You can text us on 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, and the email address is checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Ross has already got in touch and says the Erebus Memorial is a large, inappropriate concrete structure in a pristine setting. There is no connection between the Parnell Park and the air accident. The proposed structure is even far larger than the Korean War Memorial in the park that commemorates those who died defending this country. Let us know what you think. Social Development Minister Carmel Sepuloni says she and her ministry are working as quickly as they can on welfare reform, and it's easier to make recommendations than to implement them. The government is pointing to new figures on its $5.5 billion families package as proof it's on track to lift up to 74,000 children out of poverty by 2021. But the government's facing criticism that it's not doing enough, fast enough to raise people out of poverty. Here's Christchurch City Missioner Matthew Mark.
Really is just people struggling to make ends meet. And so we're literally seeing people having to make the choice between paying the power, paying the rent, putting food on the table, or all manner of different things that would be your normal day-to-day expenses.
Professor Ines Asher, who was on the government's own welfare expert advisory group, says not nearly enough is being done.
A lot of help has reached a lot of people, but in a small way. We're just talking about people needing a much larger lift up to stop the struggling and the sickness and the distress and the hunger and so on. So I think there just needs to be a much bigger lift.
So I asked the Minister, Carmel Sepuloni, what this first review or stock take of the families package actually shows.
It tells us that New Zealand families have really benefited from the families package. It gives us a clear indication of the number of New Zealanders that have received or accessed parts of the families package, and it tells us too that our numbers with respect to how many New Zealanders we were hoping to impact were really spot on.
The thing is, in the report itself, there's a disclaimer on about page 6, I think, and it says that the data does not allow us to track what difference the package itself made to payments received, family incomes, child poverty, children's outcomes, people's employment, or other measures of well-being. So it really doesn't tell us much at this point, does it?
Well, we do know that over 1 million New Zealanders benefited from the winter energy payment. We do know that in households without children or uncoupled people, that they got an additional $400 a year, $700 for couples or people with children. We do know, with respect to the Best Start payment, that 36,000 New Zealanders accessed that and so had an additional $60 per week with a new baby in the household. And the figures go on. And so those are really positive results. Our intention was always to put more money in the pockets of low to middle income New Zealanders, and we've achieved that.
Are you, though, putting that money into the pockets of those people? Because the criticism is that you've targeted the likes of a accommodation supplement and also the winter energy payment, which you mentioned there, and those payments go to electricity companies and landlords.
They support people to keep their houses warm in the winter, Lisa, and it's probably one of the aspects of the families package that I get the most positive feedback about. I'd heard too many stories, even in my own electorate, of senior citizens not wanting to turn the heater on because of the cost, and so this has made a real difference in their lives.
And I suppose a lot of people will appreciate that, but the question is whether you could be and should be doing more. I want to take a look at some other measures that are included in MSD's annual report. There are 5 performance indicators in that report. Again, that's on page 30 of the report. Among them, the number of years people spend on a benefit and the wait time for people needing social houses. At worst, your ministry is failing to meet its targets on those points, and at best it's just treading water. That must be pretty disappointing for you, is it?
Well, Lisa, I don't have responsibility for building the houses, but our government's working really hard with that respect. We stopped the sell-off of state houses as soon as we got in, and as has been reported on numerous occasions, we're ahead of target to build the 6,400 state houses that we committed to. So there is a lot of ground to make up, and we've always been very upfront about that. There is more to do, but we have to take stock, and actually I will celebrate the fact that the Families package has touched the lives of so many New Zealanders without ever saying that there's not more to do. We all acknowledge that that's the case.
Your own expert advisory group, members of that group don't think that you are going fast enough or being brave enough in your reforms. So why the delays?
Oh, look, they also acknowledge in the report that the one thing they didn't have access to when they were pulling together that really comprehensive report around welfare was they didn't have access to the modelling. Now, I'm the minister in charge of actually then working out the detail behind the scenes, Lisa, and I think lots of people do understand that it's a lot harder to do that than it is to actually make the recommendations. All due respect to the people that were on that advisory group, though.
So are their expectations too high?
I fully expected them and other groups to continue to push us along as a government and to hold us accountable. And I'm working as quickly as I can. I've got my ministry working as quickly as they can. It's just doesn't necessarily meet the expectations of some, and that's okay.
So of the 120 recommendations that were made in that report, you have, identified 3? From memory that you're going to go forward with?
No, I do need to correct that, Lisa, because actually some of the other recommendations are being responded to too. And as I said, I think previously in an interview with you, many of them are not a tick box exercise. They require ongoing work. Many of them have different elements to them. And so there's more going on in this space. If you think about what we're doing around building public housing, that responds to the report. If you think about the changes that have been made with respect to loan sharks, the credit reforms that Chris Varfoy's led, that responds to some of what was recommended
but we're talking
in there as well.
specifically about the recommendations in the report
I'm
and
talking
core
specifically
benefits.
I'm talking specifically about the recommendations as well, Lisa.
Let's look at some of the main
government
ones.
That approach that had to be taken to this.
Increase in core benefits. When will that happen?
income adequacy has been a focus for us from the start. You know, the families package shows that we're serious about addressing income
So no
adequacy
commitment to
in
increasing
low
core benefits?
to middle income homes. In terms of what else we're going to do in this space to address income adequacy, Lisa, I'm not announcing anything today. There is work going on to address income adequacy, and we will continue to do that.
And that's the problem that some of your critics have. They say that's not very transparent. They don't know what you're doing or when it will happen, and there is no commitment from you publicly to increase core benefits, even though it's one of the core recommendations of your own welfare advisory group. So what work are you doing behind the scenes in terms of an increase to core benefits?
Well, other than the families package, Lisa, we do have to remember that the 3 announcements that were made at Budget 2019 also go some way to addressing income adequacy, lifting abatement thresholds, indexing benefits to wages, and also repealing Section 192 so that we no longer have that sanction that punishes basically sole parents with children. So those 3 things put more money into the pockets of the New Zealanders that we're talking about. As I've said before, is there more to do? Absolutely.
In terms of that, though, hardship grants are up 66% from September 2018 to September 2019. So that increases is during the time that you have introduced your families package. Doesn't that show you, isn't it proof that benefits are not covering basic costs?
There's 2 things that I want to refer to with respect to that, Lisa. One is that I made very clear to MSD that we will make sure that people get access to what they are entitled to, and I think that they've been successful in doing that. Secondly, we know that special needs grants are up in places where there is a housing demand, issues with affordability with respect to housing, in particular Auckland, Bay of Plenty, 2 really good examples of that. And so we've always known that, yes, there needs to be changes to the welfare system, but alongside that, we have to have the comprehensive housing program and a range of other things. And so there's a lot happening in this space, Lisa, and it's not just in MSD. The MSD clients, the people that walk through our door, need us to be taking an all-of-government approach to their well-being and their lives, and that's what we're trying to do here.
Could you just clarify for me, what do you actually think a benefit should cover? What do you think it should cover?
Oh, look, you know, I expect that our welfare system will be fair, will be accessible, will uphold people's dignity, and, you know, income adequacy is,
so
of course, a consideration.
In practical terms, what does that mean? Should it allow them to put adequate food on the table, roof over their head, meet their health needs, participate in society, and do so with dignity? Do you agree with all of those things?
That has to be our objective. And Lisa, can I say,
so does the current level of benefit allow people to achieve that list that we've just said?
In terms of what is provided through the welfare system, if I thought that it already did, then I wouldn't have included income adequacy in the terms of reference with respect to the work that the Welfare Expert Advisory Group has undertaken.
Okay, so can you remind me what the surplus is at the moment?
The surplus at the last budget was, and keeping in mind this is not my money, I think it was $7.5 billion.
Yeah, so can you explain to people why they have to wait for these reforms to happen when you have such a significant surplus?
You know, I wish that changes were so easy to implement, Lisa. I will say, even in some instances with the recommendations that are in the report, and this is not an excuse, this is the absolute truth, we don't even have the technology in place to be able to roll them out. One that I've discussed, actually it's in the cabinet paper, that I wanted to look at is even, you know, things like child support pass on. We don't actually have the technology through our systems to even be able to do it. So I know that people on the outside say, just do something. But the reality is that it doesn't happen that quickly, and sometimes it comes down to technology and a range of other things.
Okay, so Child Action Poverty is calling for a pre-Christmas package of welfare changes. They want this urgently. Are you going to do that?
Look, I respect the role that they have in advocating for children, and I want to return to the issue that I raised earlier.
So, no, just on the package, are you going to do anything before Christmas?
You can't actually just implement immediate changes in the way that CPAG would like us to, and you can't implement changes that haven't been taken into consideration with respect to the budget. Most New Zealanders also expect us to be transparent about how and when we're going to spend money, and they expect to see that through the budget process. And so, unfortunately, what CPAG is asking for is something that is not possible.
And that was the Social Development Minister, Carmel Sepuloni there. We're getting a lot of feedback from you about the proposed Erebus Memorial that was planned to go into the Parnell Rose Gardens. Andy in Wellington's got in touch and says a sea view is a matter of real estate value. These objectives are shallow and disrespectful. Someone else says it should be in Christchurch because that is where the flight was based. Someone else says understand the protest at the park. Why not put the memorial at the airport where the plane took off? Someone else has got in touch to say wrong design, wrong place, either a different location, a museum area or a different design. And this one in saying Erebus Memorial should be where the victims last touched their whenua at Auckland Airport. Plenty of space out there. Christopher says maybe the Erebus monument should be placed in South Auckland, somewhere near the airport. Seems more appropriate.
RNZ News at 6. Ngā mihi nui ko Susana Lei Atawa tēnei. Lawyers in the trial of the man accused of murdering Grace Millane have made their closing addresses to the jury. The British backpacker died in the 27-year-old man's apartment last December. The Crown says he strangled her and it was murder, but the defence says it was rough sex gone wrong. Sarah Robson reports from the High Court at Auckland.
Crown Prosecutor Brian Dickey pointed to pathological evidence that it takes 5 to 10 minutes to kill someone by strangulation. He said during that period the victim would pass out and the person strangling them would have to keep going. He said the accused's actions after Ms Millane's death showed he didn't panic and was trying to cover up what he knew was murder. But defence lawyer Ian Brookie said Ms Millane died after rough sex between two young and inexperienced people went wrong. He said the man freaked out and acted selfishly, but that didn't reflect what was going through his mind when he put his hands on her neck. Justice Moore will sum up the case to the jury tomorrow morning. Ko Sarah Robson, aho.
The Prime Minister says she has faith in the Electoral Commission to determine whether her coalition partner has complied with the law. Jacinda Ardern says she has met with her deputy and New Zealand First Leader Winston Peters about the use of the New Zealand First Foundation for donations. But she says it's not her role to investigate other political parties.
In the same way that I did not involve myself in the Serious Fraud Office investigation that's currently underway with the National Party, it's not for me to involve myself in any investigation being conducted by the Electoral Commission. The whole point of having these independent agencies is that we allow them to do their job.
Jacinda Ardern. Ports of Auckland has come back firing at the group proposing its closure, releasing 2 reports that are highly critical of the evidence it relied on. A government-appointed working group delivered its findings last week, recommending Port of Auckland's freight operations be moved to Northland. Rowan Quinn reports.
Ports of Auckland commissioned reviews of the evidence from EY that was used by the working group to help make its decision. One review says the evidence is thin on detail, contains many untested assumptions, and ignores the large increase in carbon emissions that will come from moving the port north. But the head of the port working group, Wayne Brown, says the reviews are rubbish and aimed solely at job preservation by those at Ports of Auckland. He says the group based its decisions on talks with more than 80 businesses and organisations. I Tamaki Makauro, ko Rowan Quinn tēnei.
A National MP is calling for a ministerial inquiry into PHARMAC after 4 people died following an epilepsy drug brand switch. Michael Woodhouse says the public are owed an explanation about the drug buying agency's decision to pull funding from the Lamictal and Arrow brands of lamotrigine and switch 11,000 people to the generic version Logum. The Health and Disability Commissioner says he also wants answers from PHARMAC. PHARMAC backed down on the switch last week, widening access to Lamictal and Arrow. 4 deaths and 50 adverse events have been reported over suspicions they are linked to the brand switch. The White House says extraordinary testimony by a senior US diplomat at Donald Trump's impeachment hearing completely exonerates the president. Ambassador Gordon Sondland said he believed he was carrying out Mr. Trump's orders to put pressure on Ukraine to investigate a business linked to the Democratic presidential contender Joe Biden. The BBC's Laura Trevelyan is in Washington.
He said that he was acting at the express direction of the president on Ukraine. And the president has been saying that there was no quid pro quo when it came to Ukraine. But Ambassador Sondland directly said there was a quid pro quo, although he said it was directed by Rudy Giuliani, the president's personal attorney. And that quid pro quo was that Ukraine had to announce investigations into the president's political rivals and into the 2016 election before they could get a visit to the White House.
Laura Trevelyan reporting. Floating platforms have been set up to stop the chicks of critically endangered black-billed gulls from drowning after the birds set up home in the flooded ruins of a quake-damaged Christchurch building. The birds, which are the world's rarest gulls, have been nesting on the site of the former PwC building in central Christchurch since October. The Department of Conservation says many of the birds have built nests on precarious narrow beams surrounded by water. DOC's Mahanui community ranger, Vanessa Amanda, says people reported seeing freshly hatched chicks falling into the water where they were unable to climb or fly out. She says DOC has decided to install 4 floating platforms to act as life rafts if the chicks fall into the water. It's coming up to 5 minutes past 6. New Zealand has made a breakthrough with the second new ball to have England 203 for 4, approaching stumps on the first day of the first cricket test at Bay Oval in Mount Maunganui. England had brought up the 200 for the loss of just 3 wickets and appeared to have the upper hand on a slow day of scoring. However, the new ball helped the Black Caps cause as Tim Southee dismissed England anchor Joe Denley for 74. Medium pacer Colin de Grandhomme has taken 2 wickets and Neil Wagner 1 for the home side. Meanwhile, in the first test in Brisbane, Australia are in control against Pakistan, with the tourists 125 for 5 batting first. The Auckland Tuatara will try to put a tumultuous week behind them when the Australian National Baseball League campaign starts against Perth Heat in Auckland tonight. The club has been dealing with the death of American third baseman Ryan Costello, who died in his sleep earlier this week after recently arriving from the Minnesota Twins. Citroën is leaving the World Rally Championship with immediate effect after 6 times world champion Sébastien Ogier announced his departure from the team. Citroën Racing says it made the decision due to the absence of a first-class driver available for the 2020 season. But commercial factors were also a major consideration. Ogier is expected to join Toyota after Ott Tanak, who won the driver's title in Spain last month, moved from Toyota to Hyundai. That's the news.
Tonight on Nights, Rachel Church puts another classical masterpiece into context. This evening, J.S. Bach's Christmas Oratorio, music that's moved everyone from Jermaine Greer to Shane Carter. We've got a window on the world of American fashion and graphic designer Jeff Staple, and this week's overseas correspondent is Alison Balance, speaking to us from Scott Base on Nights with me, Brian Crump, after the news at 7 on RNZ National.
Now the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. For the whole of the North Island, fine weather. However, isolated showers for Gisborne and the ranges of Hawke's Bay and Eastern Bay of Plenty clearing tonight. Nelson and Marlborough, fine, warm weather tomorrow. Bulla, fine spells, isolated showers tonight. Westland, mostly cloudy. Isolated showers becoming widespread tomorrow evening. Canterbury, Otago and Southland, mostly fine, but scattered rain for Otago and Southland tonight. Warm weather tomorrow with norwesterly gales in exposed parts of Canterbury High Country, Southern Lakes, Central Otago, Southland and Clutha. Scattered showers returning to Southland, Clutha and Dunedin tomorrow night. Fiordland and Stewart Island, a few showers turning to rain tomorrow with norwesterly gales in exposed places. And Chatham Islands, fine weather. RNZ National, it's coming up to 8 minutes past 6.
Thanks, Susanna. If you're just joining us, this is Checkpoint and I'm Lisa Owen. The jury in the trial of the man accused of murdering Grace Millane has been given 2 very different accounts of what happened the night she died. In closing its case today, the Crown told the jury the British backpacker would have struggled for her life as the 27-year-old accused strangled her to death. This was disputed by the man's defence team, who said it was entirely plausible the young woman accidentally died died after he choked her during sex with her consent and encouragement. Our reporter Sarah Robson was in court to hear the closing addresses today, and she joins me in the studio now. And as always, a reminder that some of what we are discussing may be distressing for some people. Evening, Sarah. So, Brian Dickey, the Crown prosecutor, he was the first to make his closing address to the jury, and what did he have to say?
Yes, Mr Dickey explained to the jury, first of all, that there are two different pathways to murder. So they could find the accused man guilty of murder by murderous intent, or there's actually a second pathway, which is reckless intent or disregard for someone's life. Now, he described this as conscious risk-taking. Now, Mr Dickey said that there's actually enough evidence in the Crown's case that the jury would be able to deliver a guilty verdict through either of these pathways. Now, Mr Dickey spoke a lot about the evidence that the Crown and the defence actually called from forensic pathologists. Now, he actually cited the defence expert who told the jury earlier in the week that it takes between 5 and 10 minutes to kill someone by strangulation. Now, his point is, at some point as this is happening, the person who is being strangled will pass out. So Mr Dickey was saying that therefore the accused must have kept going, must have continued strangling Grace Millane, even though she was limp and lifeless under his hand. Now, he said, therefore, this definitely isn't a case of rough sex gone wrong. Mr Dickey also spoke about motive, which is something we haven't heard a lot of in the trial so far. Now, as he was talking about this, he held up to the jury the 7 explicit photographs that the Crown says the accused took of Ms Millane after she had died. Now, these are explicit photographs. And Mr Dickey was saying that the accused had taken these photographs for his own sexual gratification. He said Mr Dickey described them as being the accused's triumph over Ms Millane, and he called them the accused's trophy photos. Now, as Mr Dickey was explaining this to the jury, Ms Millane's parents, Gillian and David, who have been sitting in the front row of the public gallery for the last 3 weeks, Mrs Millane broke down in tears again, held her head in her hands. Mr Dickey also discussed the accused man's actions after Ms Millane's death. Now, Mr Dickey says that these point to a cover-up of what the accused had done, and that he was trying to cover his tracks, and he knew that what he had done was murder. So these are things like the CCTV footage that we've seen. He went out and hired a rental car. So he cited that CCTV footage again and described the accused man's demeanour in that. Mr Dickey said he appeared to be cool, calm and collected as he was going about all those tasks. We also heard a bit more about the Google searches that happened in the early hours of December the 2nd. So those were the Google searches for Waitakere Ranges and Hottest Fire. Mr Dickey was saying why would he search these things unless he was trying to hide Ms Millane's body. Now, Mr Dickey also made the point that to the jury that in all murder cases, manslaughter is technically available for the jury to consider, but neither side in this case has actually suggested that there's evidence to support that, and Mr Dickey says that the jury should be finding the accused guilty of murder.
Right, so what did the defence have to say when they wrapped up?
Yeah, so Ian Brookie gave his closing address to the jury this afternoon. He urged them to calmly, logically and conscientiously go through the evidence that they have heard over the last 3 weeks. Now, the defence maintains that Ms Millane's death was an accident during consensual rough sex and absolutely isn't murder. He said this was an unfortunate and unforeseen consequence of rough sex between two drunk and inexperienced young people. Now, Mr Brookie also discussed the accused man's actions after Ms Millane's death. He acknowledged that to the jury they may seem like he was acting badly, that he was selfish, and they might find those actions reprehensible. But he said that his client freaked out, and he urged the jury to consider that actually those actions don't tell them much about what was going on through the accused man's mind as he actually put his hands on Ms Millane's neck, which is obviously the critical part of what the jury must be considering. Now, Mr Brookie also talked about how the accused had voluntarily gone to the police. He had actually, in the second interview, told them what had happened the night Ms Millane died and actually ended up leading them to where he had buried her body. He said that there was ample evidence to support the accused's account that the British backpacker had actually instigated and encouraged restraint, choking, etc. during their sexual encounter.
So two very contrasting ideas of what happened, up to the jury to decide which one they believe. So what happens from here?
So we have almost drawn to the conclusion of what we will hear in court. So tomorrow, Justice Simon Moore will sum up the case for the jury tomorrow morning. And after that, a couple of hours it will likely take, the jury will begin their deliberations. Now, this trial was originally set down for 5 weeks, and we are just getting to the end of week 3 at the moment. So it has progressed a lot quicker than lawyers had initially expected.
So they'll begin their deliberations, it's expected by lunchtime tomorrow.
Perhaps by lunchtime tomorrow.
Okay, Sarah, thank you so much. Sarah Robson there with the details of that ongoing trial. And Sarah will be down at court tomorrow, obviously, and we'll bring you any developments tomorrow. More details have been laid bare of the controversial Provincial Growth Fund application by Future Forestry Products. The minister who oversees the fund, New Zealand First MP Shane Jones, is pleading ignorance after the company, which has strong New Zealand First ties, was referenced in material he had months before he declared his conflict of interest. The company's founding director, Brian Henry, is Winston Peters' lawyer and a New Zealand First judicial officer. Here's political reporter Charlie Drever.
In April, Future Forestry Products applied for a $15 million loan through the Provincial Growth Fund to carry out a feasibility study. In October, the Minister Shane Jones declared a conflict of interest, and the matter was then passed on to Minister David Clark. The Provincial Development Unit's recommendation to decline the application was then followed. But the opposition is now trying to find out why that declaration took 6 months. During a PGF briefing at Select Committee today, MB Chief Executive Carolyn Tremaine defended the application process for the project.
This application did not go through any exceptional or unusual process. It went through our standard processes. The conflict was registered, the Minister stood aside from the decision.
In October.
So, from our point of view, there has been nothing unusual with this process.
The Provincial Development Unit agreed to check if the Minister had been advised of the application, but PDU head Robert Pagoo says he'd be surprised if the Minister would have been aware before October.
A lot of the projects we get are at the risky end of the spectrum in terms of their ability to even get off the ground. So there's a lot of work that my guys do to try and work out, has this thing got a chance of succeeding or not? And that can often take quite a lot of time.
But this afternoon, the PDU has done a U-turn and says information on the project was provided to the Minister's office on 2 occasions, first in July and again in September. No decision was sought from the Minister on those occasions. But during question time, Shane Jones was adamant he was not aware of the conflict until October.
Until October the 14th, I was not formally notified of the existence of a application. I am advised, however, that officials have put in reports the name of the company they were dealing with. Unfortunately, I had no idea who that company was.
National MP Chris Bishop then questioned the Minister why he'd been in correspondence with one of the founding directors and son of Brian Henry before that time.
Why did David Henry email his office on 21 September about the project, and why didn't he declare a conflict then?
Sir, there is no conflict between myself and a Mr. David Henry, an individual I might have met once or thrice.
Mr. Jones says his conflict of interest lay with Brian Henry, and he took immediate action to recuse himself from the matter. It's the third conflict of interest declared by the Minister's office since the fund began. From Parliament, for Checkpoint, Ko Charlie Drever, DNA.
It's just gone 18 minutes after 6 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Now, this next story has all the elements of a sci-fi drama, specifically a data rescue mission involving artificial intelligence that needs to be taught human ways in order to build a time machine. Sound fantastical? Yeah, maybe, except this is actually real-world stuff. Microsoft and NIWA are pairing up and using artificial intelligence to computerise more than 1 million handwritten weather records dating back more than a century. The information will be used to better understand extreme weather patterns, including what causes them and why. But the machines need to be taught to recognise variations in handwriting so that they can translate records into a database. I asked NIWA's Dr. Drew Laurie to explain exactly how it works.
In an ideal world, we would have machines completely transcribe them, and it would be as close to perfectly transcribed as possible. But in order to do that, we've got to train the AI to learn what a 9 is, what a 6 is, what a 4 is. And you can imagine that with so many different observers and so many different variations of those numbers, it can be pretty tricky unless you have a very big and 100% confirmed training set. So this is where we come in. We've got a really massive data archive, and we've also got an army of citizen scientists raring to go to key in data. And with them keying it in for us 10 times over, we can actually evaluate which numbers have been keyed in correctly or 100% correct. And what that's going to allow us to do is to make a really powerful AI training library. And that's the whole thing. The whole premise behind this project is to actually get the training library for AI greatly augmented over what it is now.
So will you always need humans to be a component of accessing this data, or will eventually the artificial intelligence be able to do it all by itself without you?
I would like to think that it would be a really good partnership. You always need humans working in partnership with machines. They're as good as what we train them to do and program them to do. So in this regard, it will really help our science in that it can take the limited resources that we have right now for keying the data, rapidly accelerate the process of capturing the old historic data and quality controlling it, and then it gives us more time and resources to actually studying the data and figuring out what was going on with significant historic weather events.
So how much material have you actually got to play with here? What are we talking about? How many volumes?
Well, NIWA's got, linear meters, tens, if not hundreds of linear meters of old observations. For this particular project, we're focusing on the week it snowed everywhere, which was a significant snowfall event that impacted New Zealand in the winter of 1939. We're focusing on keying in all the data that we have for New Zealand for the entire winter of 1939 to give that week a richer context.
So when you talk about data from that week, you're talking about people's, descriptions, handwritten accounts of what the weather was like?
Yeah, we've got several meteorological registers that have recordings of barometric pressure, temperature, precipitation, rainfall, and also accounts of the type of snowfall that was received in different parts of the country. So that's going to be the focus of this particular project.
With all the modern innovations that you have around weather instruments and predicting and forecasting and all the rest of it, is there any suggestion that what these people recorded on a bit of paper was more accurate back then than we are now?
Probably not. There's no real assertion that we're trying to make on that front. What we're trying to do is take our modern instrumental data, and what it's going to allow us to do is merge it with older observations that go back in some cases more than 100 years. And so that richer long-term view is really important for us to evaluate, contemporary events, extreme events like things like heat waves and hot days and of course snowfall events, which seem to happen every now and again in New Zealand, and especially in the far north of the country, places like Auckland. We have had snow even recently, but we want to get a better context around why they occurred, how frequent they occur, and obviously what are the main drivers of that.
So what excites you the most about this project?
I think what excites me the most is obviously, we get fantastic historical accounts that we can look into. So it is like getting in a time machine and going back in time and looking at what things were like. But I think what's going to be really cool is when we get all the data together, assimilated in a supercomputer model of what the weather was like during that week, and really take a look at those weather maps and say, okay, well, how similar is that event to the one that we had in 2011 where we actually had snowfall in around Northland? That's going to be really cool to do those comparisons using modern cutting-edge tools in climate science. And I think that where I want to drive it with this is that it allows us to develop a suite of analyses for historic extreme events. And if we can put a fingerprint on some of those types of events, we can also apply that understanding to our forecasting.
And that is Dr. Drew Laurie from NIWA. Prince Charles is set to receive a one-of-a-kind reception when he arrives in the seaside town of Kaikoura this weekend. The heir to the throne will be meeting locals on Saturday and will see a display put together to show Kaikoura's past, present and future. Several business owners have been invited to meet Prince Charles. Among them is Kevin Cole, who has something special planned. Logan Church reports.
Come on, guys. A UK expat, Kevin Cole has lived in Kaikoura since the 2008 global financial crisis. He and his then wife wanted a new adventure. They ended up in Kaikoura, running a llama trekking business. Kevin is on the short list of business owners who get to meet Charles personally.
I've been invited to put a little sort of presentation stand together in the Memorial Hall where he's going to spend about an hour walking around meeting people. So I'm taking 2 llama. We're going to start with the llama outside on the grass for him to meet, or we'll just walk past and go, ooh, look, there's llama. And then inside there'll be more of a sort of a little bit of a display stand, and if he wants to come over and talk, then obviously I'll share some stories about meeting llama.
That's right. Kevin plans to bring some of his llamas into town to meet the Prince at Memorial Hall, where a display about Kaikoura's past, present and future is being set up.
So I'm bringing 2. They're called Legend, who's a sort of a black-grey llama, and Pete, who's a chocolate-brown llama. I picked those 2 because of the herd of 11 that I have, they are the most placid characters, and they know me the best. And I've enjoyed working with them, and they just know me the best by far.
Now, while Legend was happy to eat food out of our hands when I visited...
Come here, Legend. This is one of the ones coming to see meet Charles.
Pete, not so much, which could become problematic this weekend.
Stay there, Pete.
Almost.
He's too clever. Plan B is to take Max, which is the biggest one of this lot.
But no matter what llamas Kevin ends up taking, he says this royal trip represents something of a milestone for the town's recovery.
We've had a really, really terrible time over these last 3 years. It's been very, very difficult. All sorts of problems in town, lots of people ending up leaving. But we are slowly now showing signs of regenerating and rebuilding again.
Across the valley, Myra McClelland of Lavender Farms will also get to meet Prince Charles. She's still figuring out what she will display, but she thinks Charles's visit will be positive for locals and businesses.
I think it's a fantastic lift to the community. I think it's great that they're coming. They can't go everywhere in the world, so to come here is great. The fact that he wants to know about what's happened with the earthquake and where the town is now, I think is fantastic. People are going to come in, there's going to be an awful lot of media interest, and hopefully that will spark a lot more tourist interest with this coming season, which will sort of tick, I think, the final box for lots of us in recovery from the earthquake.
Myra says the goodwill he's bringing to town is similar to the positive work he's done to boost her hometown in the UK.
I'm from a place called Cumnock, which is the location for Dumfries House, which is a stately home that Prince Charles acquired for the nation. He was the spearhead of the fundraising to acquire it for the nation. Cumnock is a deprived area because we lost all our income when the pits closed. And Prince Charles has been the spearhead behind a lot of regeneration work in the area.
Kaikoura is Charles's last stop on his New Zealand tour. He will be flying out on Saturday to visit Tuvalu and the Solomon Islands, while Camilla will be returning to the UK. In Kaikoura for Checkpoint, Logan Church.
Oh, and if you were just listening to that one, it is well worth going back and looking at the pictures, if only to see Logan Church trying to wrangle a llama. So Legend and Pete set to meet Charles there, but oh I suspect Max the Spare may be subbed in. Let's get to some of your feedback. On PHARMAC's epilepsy drug brand switch, we've had a lot of feedback on this. This person said, I had no warning about my lamotrigine switch until my doctor was writing my next prescription. I had no choice, therefore no chance to give consent. My chemist told me to try a small amount at first when I have a quiet few days. I have 4 children and not even a quiet minute, this person says. I was not impressed. I was very concerned about my driving safety, my legal rights if I crashed and injured or killed someone. It was a scary switch. And this one also on the same subject, I was prescribed Lamisetol to control epilepsy and have taken this medication for numerous years without complication. I wasn't notified at all regarding the brand change. I first learned of the switch when I went to fill my new prescription. There was no transition period. Cold turkey. I have been on the new medication for roughly 2 to 3 weeks with adverse effects. I have a doctor's appointment next week so that I can apply to get funding for my original medication, as I can't safely stay on the new medication, nor can I afford the $126 per month it will cost me to continue on my original pills. And also on that epilepsy drug switch, this person has got in touch to say, we have had no information on the lamotrigine brand change. I opted not to shift because when your life is in the hands of an organisation with so little regard for people's safety, you learn to tread carefully. I currently pay and by that I think they mean pay for themselves, and I am relieved I did. It is both diabolical and disgusting, the lack of transparency around the switch. Many people have had no idea why they are feeling low or having seizures again. It is so sad and an example of how truly broken the system is. You also have really strong views on the Erebus Memorial proposed for the Parnell Gardens. This person says, not at Parnell Park, makes that park sad for people, not there for memorial. You can remember the loss of lives without a memorial in a public park. Another person says it's not in opposition to the memorial per se, it's the sheer size and scale, and it's an inappropriate design for the memorial. Someone else says put it at Western Springs. Other one says awful design.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. Lawyers have made their closing addresses in the Grace Millane murder case, with Justice Moore to sum up to the jury tomorrow. The Prime Minister says it's up to the Electoral Commission to decide whether the New Zealand First has acted within the law relating to party donations. Ports of Auckland has shot back at the group proposing moving its operations to Northland, releasing 2 reviews critical of the evidence it used, and there are calls for PHARMAC to explain why it switched to funding an epilepsy drug brand suspected of being linked to 4 deaths. Our next news at 7.
Take the pulse of the day's news every weeknight at 10.
Austrac says that some of these breaches are ongoing and they're too voluminous to quantify.
Live with local, national and international stories as they happen.
This is my personal opinion and I'm not informed, so I want that to be clear, that my observation of the police is they need better training.
Up to date if you're up late. Lately with Karen Hay.